Throughout the 1900s, it became increasingly unpopular to say that the cause or the reason why mankind goes to war is fundamentally religious. You saw this in worldviews that grew out of a form of nihilistic atheism or similar worldviews and sorts that claimed that all of human history could be described as either a conflict between oppressors and oppressed in a political sense, or between war, a conflict between science and religion, or that war that religion itself was the most common cause for war. You saw this sort of in the rise of new atheism that claimed the source or the cause of most warfare in human history was fundamentally religious. And what they mistakenly accomplished in that accusation was that they correctly diagnosed the scenario, but improperly assumed that they were not a part of it. In fact, what we're going to start is what we're going to start with today is we're going to start with three general ideas that are used to describe war. In fact, we can start with this. Is war primarily economic, political, or cultural? And if not those three, then what? And each one of these examples that war is politics by another means is in a or not a misattribution, but a poor this translation of von Clausewitz is most easily typified in the American right or empirical empire growth. The idea that war is fundamentally cultural can be observed in a lot of the American left, as well as in Maoism, Marxism, and so forth. And then war being economic is even more difficult because it seems to be, or it seems to present itself in a sense as the most scientific in its standing, but runs aground primarily after the Industrial Revolution and with the challenges that we face today. In fact, so we're going to address each one of these ideas. But let's start with letting you know who we are. Most of you who listen to this show have most likely been listening for a time. There's a chance that some of you have been invited to participate or listen to catch up on the Redacted Culture Cast. Primary motive is a philosophical and intellectual approach to both war and violence. My background, I've seen a fair share of war for my age, and as an extension of that background, I have academically studied both rigorous philosophy and theology as a result. And like a hammer seeing only nails, we are going to engage in the philosophical explanations of these things and how we come to conclusions on ethics. Long way of saying that shortly, we know that there's a difference between going to war and doing the right thing in war. And as we see the distinction within inside gun culture or within the West or the world as a whole between combatants and non-combatants disappear, as the line which separates those gets ever fuzzier, we recognize that we as individuals are going to be held responsible either by some moral code or perhaps by some legal system for our understanding of the rules of engagement, the rules of war and ethics and violence and self-defense. It's not good enough to rely on a legal system that may or may not be captured by people who do not hold our values, to use that as the framework by which we make our decisions ethically. So if you want to jump on, thank you for being a part of this. Now onto the show, onto the subject of today. If you look at most or quite an abundance of some form like political philosophy, if you look at political philosophy as well as war ethics philosophy in the last couple decades, if not centuries, you're going to see the presence of von Clausewitz quite a bit. Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian general during the era of time after the introduction of regiments, but before we saw the industrialization of war at scale, was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. And as a result of that, you can see a lot of his beliefs when it came to war translate through his books, but also some of the challenges that he had to deal with. And On War is an intriguing translation of a book written by him that didn't really reach the height of fame until after his death, like so many philosophers do. And what you see in the book is a distinction between what is called real war and true war. Now, The importance of von Clausewitz in today's presentation is that von Clausewitz argued that the idea of war fundamentally is a political concept, that it presupposes the existence of states, that there has to be governments and organizations of people to go to war against each other before you can actually have war, that the fundamental motivations for war will almost entirely be political. And then as a result of that, we can establish rules of engagement, maybe a more gentlemanly way of engaging in war. But that was germane to his Enlightenment era day. That was the popular and appropriate in its time method of viewing war, that it was primarily political, it was primarily between states, between governments, and that the primary motivation was the extension of those governments negotiating with one another. This happened at a time where the countries of Europe were shifting from more of a kingdom mentality, where people were servants or serfs of the king, to citizens of a nation. And so his book was written in a time of transition between monarchism and nationalism. And that's not the nationalism that the left is talking to you about. That's the nationalism as in the idea of a nation state. The idea that you can have a nation state is an idea of early nationalism. And so the best example in our contemporary era, or one key example of a group of people who view war generally in a Clausewitzian sense, or as in the same accordance of von Clausewitz, would be the American right, and to some extent the way that America presents itself as a war participating party. It claims to, because we have not declared war really in a long time, but we've been engaging in warlike activity for a long time, which is something that anti-war activists like to attack America for. But but if they were to look through history, they would find out that that is actually more common, more normal, more historically accurate, if you want to say more historically repetitive than anything else. And that is not a one for one refutation. It's just because it's happened doesn't mean it's justified. But we're moving away from ourselves. So the American right is generally Clausewitzian, and their idea was that war is something that happens between peoples, it happens between governments, it happens between kingdoms, it happens between states. And a key feature of the idea of political war is the decisive battle, where two groups of people get together, they fight each other, one wins, one loses. The decisive battle decides who's the winner in the dispute. The battle can be as heroic and it can be as grand as something that you might see in a movie, Lord of the Rings, or even in a failing sense, the Braveheart, or it can be something as symbolic as simply what we experience and we observe in history, Napoleon Waterloo. So the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, as well as his defeats otherwise, were just as effective as a symbol, a breaking down of his power and ability to lead, as well as a decision amongst the nations that he was no longer, or that he would no longer be a threat. It was a destruction, it was a defeat of Napoleonic France. And so this idea that war, that conflict is a extension of politics also means that, or it has also given birth to how we understand many things like rules of engagement and how there are justifications for war versus just actions in war and just theory. And it's not so much to say that specifically this view has given birth to all of these ideas, but it has been the vessel upon which most of them have been studied, argued, and engaged with, especially on an academic level and especially within the ideas of war colleges. However, where it fails to establish, or where it struggles and it deals with, one of the challenges that it fails to engage with completely is that in some cases, in fact in many cases, war itself is not fundamentally a political struggle but a cultural one. You could see this in the way that Mao and Stalin and Lenin have engaged in ideas of revolution. The primary, if the primary concept of a Clausewitzian view of war is that it's political, then a political view has the end goal of creating a decisive battle to choose who wins and who loses. And throughout that process, it is very careful to sort out combatants from non-combatants. There are those who are participating on behalf of the state and those who are not. And when it struggles with different ethical situations, it struggles with things like, what about non-state actors and supporting roles? And then even if you were to be as von Clausewitz as possible and talking about World War II, it didn't matter which side, Axis or Allies, both sides abandoned this distinction between combatants and non-combatants at some point in time. Two easy examples: Dresden and the Blitz. So that brings up a question of, is war fundamentally cultural? Which struggles, because we have to answer what is culture first. And if politics and a political system is easier because it includes institutions, culture is not necessarily more ambiguous by intention, but culture is a much more, let's just say, it incorporates a lot more of the emotion and the history and the tradition of peoples than it's given credit. So, culture. If war is not fundamentally political, can it be cultural? It can. And what would that mean? Cultural, what might be something like, what is the belief systems that ground a country's belief in a government? Easy examples would be the revolutions. The era of revolutions that in many ways started around the time of the American and then soon following French revolutions, or continuing on even in some sense to this day. But in the 1900s, we saw two very distinct versions of revolutions that were primarily cultural in not only their strategy, but their formation, but their view. And that would be the Lenin revolution, the color revolution in Russia between Tsarist Russia and Leninist Russia, or from the czars and the monarchies in that sense of Russia into the communist Russia, and the same thing with Mao from China into communist China. Now, why are these things primarily cultural, even though they could be described as political? Communism is this idea of communism, and the way that it was used in both of these scenarios, both of these situations, contained a primarily religious element, which we're going to get into later. That's a little bit of a spoiler if you know where I'm going with this. But it primarily focused on the cultures of the people, particularly in killing off an old version of culture. This is most easily observed in Maoist China with the Reds and the Blacks, and there being black virtues like family and red virtues like state, or red virtues that were described as in support of communism. And so there's an ideological approach to this, but the way that it was waged was in the form early on as an insurgency to break or change the will of the people away from viewing monarchy or emperors or czars or the way that the country had been run as a legitimate form of ruling. If you want to see this happen in a really short timeline with a slightly less, for those of us who live in the West, a slightly less culturally foreign flavor, so to speak, study the beginning of the French Revolution, where early on you had the Tennis Court Rebellion. You had Voltaire first, the Tennis Court Rebellion, and then the explosion of rebellion and revolution across France. That being political is not sufficient. They wanted to break down they didn't no longer wanted to have a monarchy, but that wasn't purely a political intent. There was also a massive cultural shift. They wanted to move out of this era that we would refer to as the medieval, not even really the medieval or the Renaissance, but early Enlightenment, pre-mid Enlightenment rule by kings, and there was a cultural shift where people were leaving an old way of living for a new way of living. Another example in Russia would be the freeing of the serfs. Some of it you can read in some of Dostoevsky's writing, but he doesn't speak directly to or as far as I can recall off the top of my head, I have some missing points. Of course, we can go on to Solzhenitsyn with the Gulag Archipelago and how that approached the problem of cultural shifts. But the question that has to be asked, and what are the hallmarks? Let's start with, what are the hallmarks of a view that war is primarily cultural, the revolution and the activist. So if von Clausewitz and the political view of war, if the view that war is primarily politics by another means, again a bad translation, but we're going to work with it, then the primary components that you're expecting to see are armies, soldiers, rules of engagement, and the decisive battle. People fight when they fight, they fight. When they don't fight, they don't fight. There's a hard distinction between those two. That's that is the political view of war. A cultural view of war sees it more as victory being a little more ambiguous, but it's when the old ways are gone and the new ways have been replaced. And it can be institutional capture by ideological means. It can be institutional capture by just simply numbers. It could be some form of a democratic styled revolution, but even then is going to be divisive in its own sense. And a cultural view of war, again, these are primarily worldviews regarding how do we understand war. The primary components that we're looking for are the activist, the revolutionary. We're looking for the insurgent, and to some extent the guerrilla. The guerrilla might be a nice bridge between the political and the cultural, because a guerrilla is still considered a combatant in war, whereas an insurgent primarily functions by blurring that line, and so that he is able to more effectively maneuver within his world. Once again, we go back to the Maoist idea of insurgent is the fish, the people are the water. So what are the ideals? What are examples of a cultural revolution? Well, you have Marxism, for example, and this is a good place to understand Marx. Now, as much as the right and the world likes to throw shade on who Marx is, they have to come to terms that he has been one of the most influential cultural and political writers in history. What their criticism is most likely comes to is that influence hasn't necessarily been a good one. But we'll give them that for today. So we've talked about political and cultural. Now, in this almost like an anthropological differentiation or separation from these two conflicting worldviews, you have the idea, though, that war is fundamentally a result of economic struggle. Now, you see this third example. We've talked about war as being primarily political, war as being primarily cultural, and now we're going to talk about how war is primarily economic in its means. And I don't mean that, I'm not talking about economic forms of warfare. I'm talking that economic causes are the primary cause for war, that it is economic scarcity that produces war. In a political world, if we could solve the world, or in a political environment, could we solve it by, if war is fundamentally political, could we not solve war by ending any opportunity for political conflict through something like NATO, where everything would be negotiated? That would work great. If war was primarily cultural, wouldn't we be able to solve it with multiculturalism, some overarching meta worldview that contained and limited all the worldviews underneath it, or all the cultures underneath it, so that they weren't in conflict with one another? If those are two different solutions for two different views of war, the third one would be, if we could give everybody the means by which they needed to survive and thrive as communities and as individuals, would not war end? Could we literally buy out people's desire for war on a complete scale? In other words, if we discovered a solution to the energy crisis that the world requires, if we discovered infinite energy, would mankind cease then to go to war? You see where there's a flaw in this worldview, but the issue is in being presented is that the primary, or the challenge with an economic worldview, and why I keep it in sort of a third category, is because it is not a very convincing element when it comes to why people engage in war. In other words, I think of it generally as a short-term answer for a pseudo-intellectual approach. It doesn't consider a person as anything more than an economic model. But an the explanation that war is fundamentally a result of economic constraints would primarily describe war as a conflict between economic means. That means you've got two groups of people that both need the same river to fish from, and they cannot get along, and so they go to war over the river. You've got two groups of people that need the source of oil in order to continue as a society, so they go to war over that oil in order for one or the other of the countries to survive. This is an easy explanation, but it is a short-sighted explanation for why people engage in war. If we could reduce all of war simply to economic means, we would have to also reduce people solely to economic units, which is something closer to utilitarianism, but even worse. It's like the darkest version of materialism, which is why you tend to see this worldview come from boomers. No offense, bro. No offense, people, but that there is a certain connection between war being viewed as primarily an economic concern and a materialistic worldview, which comes back to the point. If you were able to solve all political concerns, and if you were able to create an overarching, or sorry, if you were to create an overarching political power, one world government, and an overarching cultural power, absolute multiculturalism, and solve all economic issues, would there still be war? This is where the worldview comes in. Now, when I started this off on how during the 1900s, specifically, it became increasingly unpopular to refer to as a primary cause for mankind to go to war being something like original sin, sinful nature, it's in their nature. This was tied to the rising presence of an atheistic form of humanism, which at this time is basically in collapse because it doesn't provide it doesn't provide an ethic it doesn't provide a very convincing foundation for ethics, nor does it end in any sort of convincing form for meaning. It essentially becomes nihilism. It divulges into nihilism. But but it also tends to refer to religion itself in the same way that maybe a 4-year-old or maybe a little bit more credit due a fourth grader would describe it as religion is believing in some great sky daddy or some sort of argument like that. But what we have realized that what we understand religions to be is moral frameworks. Religion is the thing which informs people of why they do the things they do. If I use science to determine the how, I use religion to determine the why. And that religion may be as formal as reading the Bible or as informal as trusting my gut or doing shrooms or whatever. So if you want to cue that increasingly popular video of the rave girl with the dreads and has the weird voice and talks about shrooms and stuff. Um, that's an extreme version of it, but she's got a religion, and I'll tell you for sure. So, what I'm arguing here is that if you were to create a perfect world scenario where you had one world government so there were no governments to go to war against each other, wouldn't there still be the possibility of civil war? That ultimately defeats the idea that war is primarily or solely a political endeavor between states because you have issues of civil war, but also that if you were to somehow unify mankind under the idea of a one world government, would you not still have application of war, or would we just call it something else? Would it just be policing, or would it just be quelling insurrections, whatever you want to call those words? And how big does that scale of operation have to be before we consider it a war against its own people, whether it be a propagandistic war or an economic war or a sociological conflict against a population? What would happen if we had a one world government and that one world government decided to get rid of a certain people on the basis of genetics or religion or whatever? You see how saying that war is solely an extension of a political system does not meet out very well. What about a cultural system? Well, you have some cultures which are more prone or more supportive of war than others, whether they are Christians versus like a Spartan versus like a Viking versus insert all these issues there. And then there's the argument that those cultures are actually better described as economic systems. The Vikings like to raid or decided to build or The Vikings, less decided, but more were crafted by their economic environment to turn them into raiding parties, is a very it's a very how do I say this? Not naive. It's a very generous worldview to give economic ability that much power. It turns out that that war itself, especially on a grand scale, is very expensive, and the establishment of empires hasn't reduced the opportunity of war. It has simply changed its nature and its scale. Be it the nuclear bomb or Vietnam, war didn't end when America became a superpower. It just changed its look. And so we've got issues with political, cultural, and economic explanations as the sole reasons for war. And we have that third one, that pesky one that became very unpopular, which is religious. When people think of religious warfare, they think of the Crusades. What they should think of is the Communist Revolution in China or the Communist Revolution in Russia, which is why religion and culture are so closely tied. Religion is the foundation for moral philosophy that a population holds. Culture is the system of norms that's built on top of that. Politics is even further up the chain, where politics would be the codification of institutions and the codification, the writing down, the legitimizing through papers and arguments and articles, and institutions like bureaucracies of those cultural norms. So, what you have is politics flows downhill from culture, and culture flows downhill from religion. So, multiculturalism is fundamentally a religious worldview, and it doesn't work. Multiculturalism, if allowed to succeed, will be the next crusading population, or the next people to call for crusades. The expanse of communism across Russia was functionally a holy war on behalf of the state. And what we run into and what we continue to experience here is that simple Clausewitzian worldview that the right likes to hold, where we can just easily distinguish between combatants and non-combatants and rules of war and real war, is doesn't hold up in the world outside of our easily controlled and homogenous state. So cultural war grows up and bubbles up inside that, which is primarily an activity of the American left right now. The American left is engaging in a form of cultural warfare, thus the culture war in America. But they are doing, the reason why that is, why we call this thing the culture war, is because that is that is the described primary apparatus of war making, and it is a spectrum. It is a multi-use tool. It has different ways of doing it. It's a series of books we can again go through, which I've read in the past, but we can always bring up again to address these concerns. One of them, Easy Antifa Handbook. And so you have political means. You have Joe Biden denies the existence of Antifa, but they have Antifa chapters with titles, flags, ranks, orders, books, doctrine, theology, whatever. It's a little weird, but that's just kind of how it works. It's a cultural first format. They view their unity on a cultural level, not so much on a political level. And then there's the economic explanations of things, that all war can be somehow boiled down to something as simple as a war for oil. Materialism produced this view. And of course, it's in that boomeresque way that is bleeding over into the millennials that you very oftentimes see the Russian war, the Russo-Ukrainian war described, is that Russia is trying to acquire the material means by which its existence is dependent. Maybe it's a land bridge to Crimea. Maybe it is the grain belt of Ukraine. Maybe part of that material benefit that they are looking to acquire is the Carpathian Mountains as a shield from NATO. But these are different ways of describing the war as primarily economic. And so whether it is the anti-war activist who claims to be a pacifist, who will give no second thought to hiring an armed man to enforce their will, so long as that man is paid by the state, or the libertarian anarchist who revels in a world where they have no masters, with no government, who believes that they will somehow be immune to pillaging empires. Our concept of the social order and of war go hand in hand with how we think of our world, our worldview, which then again is a religious concept. And what you can take away from this thing is all wars fundamentally are holy wars. all wars, in their final analysis, are religious wars, because in order to have a justification for going to war, you must have a moral system by which you understand it. And so instead of this being a gotcha for those atheists in the club, it is an invitation to say, if we are going to engage in honest conversation regarding the nature of war and the rules of engagement within war, we have to start from an honest, even ground. And if you are going to provide any form of moral argumentation for whether or not a specific war should or should not be waged, or whether or not war is itself fundamentally cultural, political, economic, or otherwise, if you're going to engage a moral framework, we must be engaging with some semblance of understanding of morals, of a religious view. And that doesn't mean that your worldview, when it comes to religion, has to be the Christian worldview, but you are not going to get away with claiming that you're not religious, unless you're a nihilist or just a pure might makes right person. And if that's the case, then I don't know if argumentation is really best for you. But yeah, there's not. We could get into the bitter sarcasm of that another time. And so, if this, in summary, in closing, we will continue to operate talking about these concepts: war as being fundamentally political, war as being fundamentally cultural, war as being fundamentally economic, or primarily war as being fundamentally religious. And in the pursuit of understanding what are the rules of engagement for an individual, when not only are the ideas of enemies and allies much more ambiguous, but the distinction between combatant and non-combatant continue to be less convenient as uniforms, or be less apparent and obvious. This will apply to people who are interested in the philosophy of self-defense and how to, a philosophical understanding of the use of force for self-defense, owning a gun to protect yourself, or the rights of the individual to bear arms. How do we derive that an individual may have a right to bear arms in a country while maintaining a distinction between the armed population, or a military individual, and a citizen? And is that a distinction that we can continue to make? And if the answer is no, if we are going to claim that there is no fundamental difference between a citizen and a veteran, or a citizen and a soldier, when it comes to their rights, then what does that leave us for responsibilities? And that is the purpose and the objective of the Redacted Culture Cast. And that is why we started this. And that is how I got here. And that is how we are going to continue. And so if you want to support the show, if you want to be a part of the program, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. That is going to be our locals page, where we get to engage, instead of dealing with Patreon's threat of censorship, because that's been an issue in the past, not particularly with us, but with people we know. Or if you want to join in the conversation there, we have open chats. That's where you're going to see some reviews, particularly coming up of, I have an unfired SR-25 and an unfired M110 clone, as at the time of recording, M110 clone by Palmetto State Armory. And they're both the similar. The funny thing is that the SR-25 upper fits on the M110 lower. But I'm going to be doing a long form review on those. You're going to get to see how they started, where they've been at in the middle, and then where they get to in their conclusion. And all of that's going to be on locals. So if you want to support the show, we've got some more things coming along the lines with radios behind there too. So that's where you want to join us, at the Black Site on locals. Or if you want to support the show and pick up some of our stickers and our little t-shirts and things like that, we've got a pretty big sale going on with our Cabin in the Woods series, which once they're gone, they'll be gone, in conjunction with Archway Defense. If there's going to be a puzzle for you to solve on the inside of the shirt. But all of that's on a massive sale right now. You can find that at Redacted Culture or redactedllc.com. Again, those two places, redactedculture.locals.com and redactedllc.com. If you want to support us, in any other way you can share this video with your friends. Sharing is the only way that we're going to grow at scale. We are not going to be able to beat the YouTube rules. It's not that we're going to try to beat their rules. We're not going to be able to beat TikTok dancers and all that kind of stuff. The only way that we can grow as a community is if we do it by choice. So if you want to share the show, share it with your family, share it with your friends, share it as a method of engagement, I would appreciate that. Leave a comment below if you're down on YouTube, or other than that, we will see you soon. We'll talk to you soon. That being the case, go forth and conquer.